All right, I am here at the National Conference for Media Reform with the one, the only Marcy Wheeler, amazing writer and blogger. You can find her work at mtwheel.net. Marcy, thanks for talking with me today.
Hey, thanks.
So, we're going to talk about Anwar al-Awlaki, the man who, one of the men that President Barack Obama has assassinated, and some of the intricacies of statements. So why don't you lay it out for us?
Yeah, so al-Awlaki was purportedly the only American who was deliberately killed. Everyone else, they're working on a kind of sitting next to a baddie legal, that's what I call it, is that, he was sitting next to al-Awlaki himself or sitting next to a different target, and that's how they normally have killed Americans. But with al-Awlaki, they went out and they targeted him repeatedly. And their justification for targeting him, first of all, it changed. In February of 2010, the then Director of National Intelligence basically said, if somebody does something that leads to a threat to America, then they are targetable. And that was interesting because al-Awlaki was first kind of really talked about after the Nid al-Hassan attack in Fort Hood, but years of study have shown that he didn't have any role in the Nid al-Hassan thing. But what happened after that is Crazy Pete Hoekstra immediately started leaking that there had been emails between al-Awlaki and Nid al-Hassan and turning it into a political issue. And I think that at that point, the Obama administration felt like they had to go after this guy, so al-Awlaki was first targeted Christmas Eve, 2009, in one of those sitting next to a baddie standards.
Right.
And afterwards, we have a WikiLeaks with President Ali Abdullah Saleh from Yemen talking to David Petraeus, kind of saying, oh, bummer, we didn't get al-Awlaki. So, it really does look like they were targeting al-Awlaki, but they claimed that they were just using the sitting next to a baddie thing. But then sometime in early 2010, and then again in June or July of 2010, the Office of Legal Counsel at DOJ wrote a memo authorizing al-Awlaki's death. And they ultimately said you have to be a high-level leader of al-Qaeda or an associated force.
Whatever that means.
Right. And that because interestingly, AQAP wasn't even on the terrorism list when they first targeted al-Awlaki.
Al-Qaeda in Arabian Peninsula.
Right. And AQAP didn't exist on 9/11, so the language of the AUMF should prohibit going after them, but that's only if you actually read things and think they mean what they say. So al-Awlaki. Meanwhile, they first targeted him Christmas Eve. Christmas Day, of course, was the underwear bomber attack, which was, he had trained in Yemen, so it was a Yemeni-based attack. And the night he was captured, the undie bomber confessed. He had about 45 minutes of conversation, and he said that a guy named Abu Turak was the one who had planned the attack, done a martyrdom video, and told him to wait until he was over the United States to target. Mm-hmm. Then the underwear bomber shut up for a month, and it wasn't until the end of January 2010 when he started cooperating, and the government after that point said he implicated al-Awlaki, and it was based on that, and there's been a lot of reporting since then which said that was the moment when the government had evidence he was operational and therefore could target him.
Yeah.
Which was really convenient timing because it came just as they were publicly, they came literally after Dana Priest said that al-Awlaki was on at least DOD's targeting list. Mm-hmm. So already it's really dubious.
Yeah.
And then by April of 2010, CIA had him on his list, purportedly because of what Abdul Muttalib said.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is Abdul Muttalib had a basically one-day trial in November of 2011. So in October of 2011, but just weeks after al-Awlaki was actually killed.
Yeah.
And for a variety of legal reasons, the government used his initial confession in their description of what he did. They didn't use the later confession. So that's access. that allows us to know what he originally said. And then in sentencing, so in January, February of 2012, they submitted a document which offered a completely different narrative. And in that narrative, they said that al-Awlaki was the one who chose the target. Al-Awlaki is the one who made a martyrdom video, and al-Awlaki told him to wait until he was over the United States until he ignited the bomb. And, I asked DOJ at the time, I said, why are you telling two entirely different stories about who was responsible for the attack? And they said, Abu Tarak was, and it's true that nobody in Yemen knew the name Abu Tarak. Nobody's an expert on AQAP news. So, but they said Abu Tarak was a pseudonym for al-Awlaki. But what's interesting about that is they also claimed that Abu Tarak made the bomb, and we believe we know that Ibrahim al-Asiri, who's a Saudi, actually made the bomb. So it's not in fact the case that Abu Tarak was one pseudonym for just Anwar al-Awlaki.
Yeah.
And so their initial response was clearly, at best shorthand.
Yeah.
But since then, I've gone back and looked at the first day of the trial, and there's this really burning question I have about the initial confession, or not about the DOJ's narrative, which is that Anwar al-Awlaki made Abdulmuttalib's martyrdom video with him. Because you have al-Awlaki, who is the best English language propagandist Al-Qaeda ever had.
Yeah.
And you have Abdulmuttalib, a guy who lived much of his life in English. I mean, he had lived in London, elite family from Nigeria, absolutely fluent English speaker. He was in Yemen to learn Arabic. He was not a fluent Arabic speaker. And he made his martyrdom video in Arabic.
Yeah.
And which is, crazy to begin with, because to do an attack like Abdulmuttalib tried to carry out, you need somebody who's got a visa or got a passport that will allow them into the United States, which is English speakers.
Right.
And so if you want to recruit more people to do what he did, you want to recruit them in English.
Yeah.
And then the other interesting thing is, in his address, the people that he was addressing his martyrdom video to, he addressed it to people on the Arabian Peninsula. Again, makes absolutely no sense.
Right.
And the prosecutor, when he was explaining this in the one-day trial, was sort of like, oh yeah, it's because he didn't know what attack he was going to carry out. And it doesn't make sense. I mean, it's a really, really big hole in their al-Awlaki case.
Well, especially if you're planning to do this major, attack that's blowing up an airline. If supposedly this is what you're trying to do, you're going to have all those actually ready to go. If that is actually the narrative that otherwise, why are you doing it? That's like the point of doing it initially.
Right. And so it's funny because I've asked experts on jihadist culture, like, well, why would you do that? And they said, credibility. And then I said, well, has anybody else made a martyrdom video in English? Oh, no, not that I know of. Faisal Shahzad made his in English. Humam al-Balawi, who's the guy who suicide bombed himself at Khost and killed 7 CIA people, who's not a native English speaker, made his partially in English. Those were both after Abdulmuttalib's attack, but also the Liquids plot, the people who were responsible for us not being able to bring our shampoo on the plane, they also all made their martyrdom videos in English, and they're people that Abdulmuttalib would have been aware of because he was in and out of London through that period. So, it's clear that they do make them in English. They make them in English for the very good reason that those are the people that you'd really like to recruit. So for some reason, Abdulmuttalib did not.
Yeah.
And I think that's a pretty good piece of evidence that says DOJ's narrative about al-Awlaki doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Again, just the whole idea is twisted. The whole idea of without a trial, just it's clearly unconstitutional. It's clearly and just the obviously it's something you write about constantly, just the utter secrecy and it's tyrannical. It's any horrific word you can come up with, and the fact that they don't even bother. They think so little of the American people that they don't even bother to have their lie straight. Is even in some ways to me more telling that they think so little of of the public that they feel that they can just give like 50 different versions? Or I mean, what do you?
Well, two things. One is, in addition to that, and this is again something that I increasingly focus on. One of the charges that Abdulmutallab was found guilty of is conspiracy to use WMD. Mm-hmm. Conspiracy always involves more than one person, and yet even there, they never charged al-Awlaki. They claimed that Abdulmutallab was their single best witness against al-Awlaki, and yet they never charged al-Awlaki in the same in the attack. And that's the one attack which the government has made aggressive claims that al-Awlaki was the operational head of. So, but the other thing I would say, which is interesting, is that I think one of the reasons that they thought that this would work for them is that this is what happens in the reason they didn't use his later confession in the trial. One of the reasons, and the reason that his lawyer, Abdulmutallab's lawyer, complained about them using it in the sentencing is because it was part of the plea negotiations. It was sort of a proffer, and there were discussions between his lawyers and the government, and the government was basically saying, well, if you'll implicate al-Awlaki, then we'll send you to Club Med instead of to Florence Supermax, which is where they ended up sending him. And he ultimately did not take that plea. He did not, he did plead guilty, but without any plea agreement with the government. And I think that's why they never used that confession and felt like they couldn't use the confession. But it's interesting because there's definitely the sense that, and they actually, once they finally put al-Awlaki on the targeting list, they appeared to have kind of taunted Abdulmutallab that al-Awlaki was going to be killed, and that al-Awlaki probably wouldn't go to heaven because he, solicited prostitutes and what people believe was an FBI sting. But I guess my one of my points is that the government does this in plea negotiations all the time and gets away with it.
Yeah. And
I think that that's why they believed it would work. And frankly, that's what a lot of terrorism cases are, is people pleading out. And I mean, that's what a lot of drug cases are too, is people plea out and implicate somebody else, and that's how they get less time.
Yeah. Marcy Wheeler, you're not going to find a more knowledgeable writer on this stuff. If you're not reading m2wheel.net, you're a fool. It's the most knowledgeable. You're one of the most knowledgeable people out there, and you're doing amazing work for something that needs so much more attention. So really, thank you for all the work you do on this. It's so unbelievably important, and thanks for talking with me today.
Thanks so much.